Welcome back, beautiful people. This is episode 77 of An Untold Narrative, where we feature creatives from all around the world. And today's guest, Austin Pietrobono, nailed that last name, is actually joining us from Shanghai. I think you're going to be our first Asian-based guest, which I'm super pumped
Nice.
about. Welcome to the show.
Yeah, sweet. Thanks, David, for having me.
Of
It's cool to be
course.
on here.
Yeah, no, it's we got connected through a friend, and then we chatted a few months ago, and your journey's really been incredible. You have a different take on creativity than most of my guests, so I'm really excited to deep dive into it. You are based in Asia, obviously. We definitely want to talk about your journey and how you got there and why you're living there as a kind of like an expat. I think those stories are always amazing, but what I like to start with usually is like kind of how you got your creative start, or like,
Mhm.
where you grew up, or kind of like your family kind of, youth, and kind of what's inspired you along the way, and, just a little bit of the beginning parts of your journey.
Sure, yeah, yeah. So I grew up in Phoenix, in Arizona, which wasn't the most like exciting childhood, but I feel like I definitely was drawn to. I wouldn't necessarily have known to call it design when I was a kid, but I was always obsessed with like just like products, and especially like like for example, like when the iPod came out, I was like, ooh, like there's this thing called a creative Zune. I don't know if you remember those, but they were like some of the first MP3 players that had like the touch sliders. And they had
Yeah.
like these cool colors on it, and then I had a Zune after that. So like I was always sort of drawn to, I guess, product design, but uh, was always sort of like interested in sort of these, like, not necessarily like mainstream products, but or like mainstream ones, but ones that had sort of implemented technology in a different way or earlier, or just sort of like a more interesting take, especially in terms of like industrial design language. And I didn't have any of this terminology as a kid, but I just thought it was really interesting. Was always drawn to kind of this like gadget and device kind of culture, and so I think that was sort of my dad was also is a aeronautical engineer, so I was always around sort of things being made and kind of designed. So I think that was a big part of it. Yeah, and then uh, growing up in Arizona, I was just extremely bored, and so going to college, I was like, I got to get out of here, and so I went to school in upstate New York, to an engineering school called RPI. Um, and I got there and I was like, okay, I'm going to be an engineer. And like, I don't know, I'm not like super interested. I was never super interested in like, I guess what makes a good engineer, like the core like calculus and sciences. But I was like, I want to make stuff or like have some sort of. I just had none of the vocabulary to, now having worked in sort of the creative industries, I have sort of the perspective and the like mental tool set to think about it. But back then I didn't know what like branding was, or like how you could sort of contribute to sort of the product experience without necessarily being like an engineer.
Mm.
So anyways, I got to engineering school, and I was like terrible at the coursework, and then just so disinterested in it. And so I was sort of like, I don't know if this is like a great fit. But the school had like a very small um, design program that was sort of like modeled like the Stanford D school. So it was, everyone had this design degree, but then you had to have some sort of dual majors. So whether you were design and mechanical or design and comms, everyone had sort of this like dual skill set that they were pursuing. And so I was able to transfer into that program. And I think that's where a lot of my interest in design in general sort of started. Had a lot of exposure to kind of core studio design coursework, sketching, CAD. But also a big part of the program was thinking about sort of these large problems, like how do you develop products for sort of this extreme use case. So I think a little different than like an industrial design degree where you're like really focused on core skills like sketching and like really getting the craft down. This was a little
Mm.
less focused on craft and more like, I guess, problem scoping and sort of applying engineering to different problems. But yeah, it just I think the ultimate thing I got from this is that we were a small group of people that were interested in working at some really interesting companies, and so I was able to during school work at Hasbro, which is a
Sure.
yeah
The toy
big
company, yeah.
toy company in Rhode Island, and then uh, that led me to then working at a startup in Boston that was spun out of the Media Lab. They do it's called Form Labs. They do 3D
Yeah,
printing.
of
Um,
course. Yeah,
yeah,
I'm
so
familiar with
yeah, so I was able to basically go from an R&D perspective at Hasbro in college to my last internship in college was with Form Labs, and that was on a proper marketing team, and that was sort of my first kind of professional experience working in design, but not from like a product development. You know, we were doing the brand and marketing, and so that was kind of the first time I was connecting dots of like, oh, I don't have to necessarily be a product designer to sort of contribute to things like the like user experience or kind of what people interact with and kind of the emotions that a product or a brand can kind of instill in people. And yeah, so that sort of, I think going out of college, that kind of set me with like a good kind of perspective. And then I got,
that.
yeah. And then after college, I took a job with IBM. They had like this very sort of open role that was sort of like, you'll be doing marketing and design. We don't really know what you're going to do yet, but we're like hiring a bunch of you and it's going to be cool. And it's in New York. And I was like, okay, I don't, it sounds really interesting. I just don't know exactly what it's going to be. And yeah, that turned out to be a really great role because I was able to I started there as like a product designer doing um, digital products. So we were basically using um, IBM's like AI model to do like sales and marketing software. And then I transitioned to a brand role where I was like working on an actual brand team. And at the time, IBM was sort of doing a lot of work on its corporate brand like typeface. And so I was actually able to work on like the launch of a typeface during my time there and got a lot of exposure to some senior creative directors that they had there. And it just set me up with a ton of experience that I think would then sort of launch kind of the next phase of my career.
Yeah, that's thanks for the fast track time. That's a lot to unpack there. That is a healthy resume, dude, in like a short amount of time.
Yeah,
Um
I was I think in school I sort of I to me like a lot of students were doing something either like a co-op
right.
um, or studying abroad, and I just didn't really I wasn't in a financial position to do study abroad, and I was like, if this co-op the co-op program the co-op deal sounds awesome. You get to basically not do school and get paid
Mhm.
like a full-time employee for a semester. And so um, I sort of really gravitated towards that. And I guess all during college, I was very focused on like, I want to try a bunch of different things now so that I have a better understanding of what I want to sort of do when I leave.
Where does that come from? Like that's super rare, right? Like you know, not everybody's driven to try a bunch of shit and then figure out what they like and what they don't like. Like you went from like a toy company to a 3D printing company to IBM, which is those three in itself are like three different universes.
Yeah, I, I, I'm not totally sure. I do know like the exposure we had within the program, I think was really sort of addicting for me. Like RPI doesn't really sort of get looked at by a lot of companies like Apple and sort of these creative companies. But this program, like literally this, I think it was 100 of us across all 4 years. But it was like out of the small group, people were going to like Apple and Burton and Hasbro and starting their own companies. And so to me, that just seemed like the place to be in terms of working in sort of innovation and design. And yeah, once you're, I don't know, I felt like once I was in the program and I was able, after this sort of first experience at Hasbro, you sort of get noticed and other people are willing to talk to you and kind of bring you on, especially for an internship. It's so low commitment.
Right.
And yeah, I was sort of hooked on it.
So you obviously started, it's so funny you said you started in like engineering, and I went to Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston.
Oh yeah.
Which is, so they didn't accept me into architecture, which is what I wanted to do, but they accepted me into civil engineering, and I hated civil engineering. Like, it was not creative. It was very like straight up, like learn about bricks, like, very,
Right.
very like engineering focused. And then I switched over into design. So it's super funny that you say that. Do you still use part of that engineering brain? Like, I mean, we're going to get into like the branding side and like the more creative stuff that you do, but like, it sounds like you inherently do have like that tinker brain, problem solving brain, like, maybe from the roots of your father and things like that.
Yeah, I think I definitely use it. So much of my work now is sort of split between kind of traditional graphic design, so sort of visual compositions, and then the other part is motion design. And I definitely use it in a lot of the motion design work. So
Mm,
much of that is less like, whereas I think graphic design is you're sort of composing different visuals on a screen or on a piece of paper, and the motion stuff is like partially that, but a lot of it is figuring out things like timing or writing code actually to sort of streamline things or have more advanced animation. And so I definitely I use a lot of it. I use a lot more of that sort of skill set and mindset now that I'm a lot of my work now is mostly motion.
yeah. Well, talk about the experience at IBM, because that's obviously a company that everybody should know. I mean, it's a large behemoth in the world of companies. What's the best part and the worst part from your experience from working there?
Uh, so I think the the best part was just the exposure I was able to get to really talented designers at such a early part in my career. So this brand team I was on, the creative director that was so basically IBM went through this whole phase of they recognized the value of design, and so they spun up this whole sort of business unit, IBM Design, but they were still trying to the brand from like especially a digital perspective still existed in all these sort of like compartments across the internet, and so they were trying to pull a lot of that back kind of into a central place, and they were able to hire a couple of creative directors that had come from they had been at Wolf Allens and then MoMA, and so they basically hired them from MoMA to come to IBM with the sort of the charter of and the responsibility of bringing a lot of that very high level brand design back to like a core central visual system, and then kind of tying that system around a typeface. And so just like a monumental project, like any sort of company doing its own typeface, especially in-house, is especially for a company that has such a big footprint as IBM. So it was just a very like large and kind of like a global scale project. And I was contributing as a motion designer, but I really got to have a lot of it was a great education in a very short amount of time on sort of that craft element and how kind of high level professional graphic designers operate and run teams. A lot of stuff that my college experience wasn't really focused on. So I think that part was really amazing. I think the worst part of IBM is it is huge and it's extremely slow. And
Mm,
so I think that's ultimately why I did end up leaving IBM. Is I had this great exposure to these sort of late stage career designers, but I was so early in my career that I definitely was sort of looking to move at a faster pace or just like learn more.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
that makes a lot of sense, and a lot of the creatives that I get the opportunity to talk to, and myself similarly, it's like the corporate structure is amazing for exactly what you said, the exposure to a vast variety of projects, or like the scale of the project.
Mm.
But at some point, it's like if you're a creative and a tinkerer, and you're always like trying to fast track things, like it's going to slow you down as that kind of person. So where'd you go from IBM? Like I really want to get into like how the hell did you end up in China?
Yeah, so yeah, I was at IBM sort of just like I was in New York City and I was kind of like I'm interested in going somewhere else, but also because of the work my dad had done. At one point, he worked for a Japanese semiconductor company, and so he was in Japan a lot, and he brought us on a couple of business trips. So that was my only exposure to East Asia, but I had been there a few times, so I was I really liked Japan. I liked sort of generally like East Asian culture, and so I was sort of like contemplating this move, and I was like, it would be really cool to live in Asia before like the end of my 20s, and so these were just sort of things I was thinking in my head. But one thing I sort of always do, and I still do, is I keep like a list of brands that I admire and like are
Mm,
interested in, and so and I sort of like edit it as I sort of go and kind of learn more about teams. And I don't know, I just it's like a very active list that I keep updated. But I was going through this list sort of while I was kind of looking casually at stuff in New York, and then one of the brands was this phone company called OnePlus. I had first heard of them when I was like working at Form Labs, the 3D printer company, I think. But they just seemed really cool. It was like they were sort of doing a lot of interesting things with marketing, but they had a lot of industrial design touches for their product that I hadn't really seen before. And so they seemed really interesting. And then so I was like, oh, I'll check them out. So I went to like the website, and then there was like a job opening for a graphic designer in Shenzhen. And I was like, oh, I don't know why they would hire like me, but I don't know. I just like look at the job posting, and then I remember from the job posting, it was you could like clearly see that it was written by someone in sort of like marketing and brand speak. It wasn't just like one of these LinkedIn
mm.
postings that you just kind of do for SEO purposes. And so I was like, oh, they've got like a copywriter or something. And I was like, maybe I don't know. I was like, whatever. I'm just gonna send my resume and portfolio and see what happens. Um, and then I got an email from their HR team, and they were like, oh yeah, like we have tons of foreigners here. We have a team of probably 40 to 60 foreigners that are all in Shenzhen, and we kind of
Wow.
run the brand globally out of here. Um, and so I was like,
Oh
okay,
shit.
wow. So then from that point, it was like, oh, game on. This is interesting. Um, and yeah, and then I think probably like a month and a half later, it was a long interview process, but then they gave me an offer, and it was sort of like, do you want to come to China and like join us? Like, here's here's the offer. And I just remember the day I got the offer, I was like, if I say no to this, I will always think about like that opportunity I had to like move to a completely like foreign place that I had no experience with. And so I was like, yeah, sure, yeah, I'll do it. And then, yeah, like 2.5 or like 3 weeks later, I flew from LA to Hong Kong, and then was in Hong Kong for like a weekend, and then literally just like crossed the border on the metro into Shenzhen with like all of my stuff in a
Yeah,
suitcase.
with your life in a couple bags.
Yeah, yeah, literally a suitcase, like a roller bag and a backpack.
So the offer must have been like appealing, right? I want to like. There's a ton of creatives that listen to this, right? And like
Mm.
the job and the career, when to take a risk and when not to take a risk is like always a topic of conversation. Like the offer must have been like semi decent to be able to be like, okay, I'm gonna give up everything I have in New York to like move to a different planet. Or were you just like, no, it's the thrill of the experience that I'm seeking right now?
Yeah, I think it was a bit of a mix of both. I mean, like the 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 offer wasn't the offer wasn't like crazy high, but when you, I mean, moving to a completely new place, especially like not not rural China, but not Shanghai or Beijing. Like
Yeah.
those two cities are very much like competitive with New York in terms of
Mm.
um, cost of living. But a place like Shenzhen is like once you do all the sort of math around how much you're sort of actually making there, the offer was pretty good, just like
In
comparatively
terms of
to like
cost of
New York.
living.
Yeah. So it sort of checked that box from like it's not that much of a risk. Like it's not the same pay, but it's also not, you know, your take home is still quite a lot. And then yeah, it was also just a little bit of like, I'm not going to let that sort of get in the way of seeing what this is about. Um,
What was what was the like you did obviously didn't know anybody in China. What
no,
was the what was the biggest like fear for
I,
from you?
it's just so like it's so much. Um, I think the first 6 months of moving there is so much just mental work of figuring out how to sort of acclimate and survive. I think it's probably easier. You know, I have a lot of friends in Shanghai that moved to China after they had studied Chinese in college, so they actually had a quite a good base of the language. I knew nothing about. I knew I knew not one word of Chinese or anything really. I mean, generally things about the culture, but from a very American perspective. So I literally just kind of rocked up in Shenzhen and was like, okay, this is where I live now, I guess. And so, yeah, it's a lot of culture. It was a lot of like kind of dealing with culture shock while also trying to like start a new job. Um, but it was definitely it was yeah, it was definitely worth it, and it was um, especially like pre-COVID. Once you got sort of acclimated to kind of life um, in China, it was awesome. Especially like where Shenzhen is, it's you're close to Hong Kong, you're close to all of Southeast Asia. For me, it was like, and I think it's still a part of my experience here. Like travel is so connected to like why I live here,
Mm.
and it was just an awesome experience. Like being able to still work, kind of working towards a design career, but being in a place where I can sort of do that during the week, and then on weekends be in a place like Hanoi or like different parts of Thailand or Indonesia. It was just amazing being able to sort of have um, that balance.
Mm.
And then it feeds back into the work too, because so much of the work at OnePlus was around community, and especially in those kind of the like the 2017 to 2019 period. So much of it was about the camera. So like
Mm.
literally when I would travel, it was all shooting with our device. I would literally bring like a few devices, shoot different shots. So like for me, it felt kind of like just fun and travel, but I think it was also sort of building
It was
into the work
fuel.
as well.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was fuel to the creative fire. Yeah, that's that I mean that sounds like a beautiful like mixture of like your 20s like you said like that it was like on your quote unquote bucket list and like you know you were able to tackle it Yeah, and for those like that aren't aware, like when you're in like let's call it mainland China, maybe not as like rural as what you're talking about. Like Shenzhen's
Mm.
still a city, but like there's like very little English signs even. Like there's not like for somebody who doesn't speak the language or know anything about it, like that I don't know if I could do that. Like that is a like hats off to you. Like that takes a lot of gusto.
Yeah. Well, I was I was really lucky because the team at OnePlus, you have a group of foreigners around you that are
Mm.
many of them were in a similar situation at one point, and so you have this really great kind of like support network of people that are like, let me show you how to do it, or let me take you around and kind of like help you, because yeah, it's because I think if you're on your own, it's just it can be like really overwhelming.
Mm.
And the yeah, so I guess what I meant to with like the um, Shenzhen is I think Shenzhen from like a sort of Western perspective is a lot of times equated with Beijing and Shanghai in terms of sort of like economic and sort of China has like a tier system for their cities, so it's sort of even with them on kind of on those things, and I think its perception is as a very outward facing city, but internally in mainland China, Shanghai and Beijing are where a lot of foreigners are, so English is much more widely spoken, and it's a place where you just run into foreigners like on the street, whereas like Shenzhen is very much it's the home of China's tech companies, and so they're Chinese tech companies building products for a Chinese market, and so it's actually where most people that you meet in Shenzhen are actually not from Shenzhen; they're from other parts of China. So you meet lots of people from like Hunan or like Wuhan or Jiangsu, like these different provinces that are sort of nearby, but not directly from Shenzhen. Um, so
And
it's much more inward facing.
And
Uh,
so today you talked about the 2017 to 19 period. Today you live in Shanghai. And
mm,
so talk about like I'm curious as to like, okay, you got this amazing experience. You worked for this phone company, OnePlus, which I personally I've never heard of. I'm sure it's amazing. Um, what drove you to stay? Right? Like is it like a culture thing for expats? Like once you're hooked and like you just like love living there? Or like what I guess what fueled like the next phase of your career and your life?
yeah. When I was so I had been there for at OnePlus for about 3 years, and I was sort of getting to the same place where I was at IBM. Also, we had a lot of different changes within the team. People were like we were expanding to different geographies, so people were leaving China to spin out like a London office or move elsewhere, and so it was definitely like a period of transition for the company. I had been able to do some like really awesome projects, like we spun out like a brand magazine at OnePlus, and was able to like actually got to shoot photos for the McLaren team because we had this partnership with McLaren
Oh, sick.
at the British Grand Prix. So I was like in the pit with their crew, shooting photos for this magazine that we just decided to like do. Um, so had done a couple things like that in the past year that were really awesome, and I think for me felt like a sort of capstone on the experience. And so
Mm.
I was sort of looking. I was, at this point, I had enough sort of high profile work where I was talking to some agencies back in New York or other places in Asia, just like trying to see what my options were and thinking about, I definitely didn't want to. I was interested in still being an expat, but I was also like the work comes first, and so just trying to evaluate what was possible. And I remember when I went up to Shanghai for a couple weekends, and I was like, man, this place is great. Like, it's got it's still in China, but it has a lot of the things that I loved about Hong Kong. Like living in Shenzhen, you go over to Hong Kong a lot, and so it feels a lot. It has the same sort of vibe and attitude that Hong Kong felt like it had, and so I was like, oh, that could be cool. And there were tons of agencies in Shanghai, like just like big agencies, small agencies, lots of different startups. So there's just a lot going on creatively. And so I think at one point I was just like, maybe try. I'm going to try to see if I can, if I'm going to live longer in China. I think moving to a city like Shanghai will sort of help kind of take this from like a 3-year experience to like a 5 to 6 year experience. And so yeah, I was just sort of, I literally was like had just started the job search, and then uh, ended up the team at, because I was like, I sort of had just gotten my portfolio up and stuff, and then the team at Binance actually contacted me about a brand designer role there, and I was like, oh, I don't know, like this sounds cool too. It was sort of the same thing with OnePlus. I knew I knew a little bit about the brand. I didn't know a whole lot about the business, and so took like a leap of faith and joined them, and then moved up to Shanghai.
Yeah, that's amazing. And obviously, Binance is one of the bigger crypto financial based companies for those unaware.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how many years have you been now in Asia total?
I've been here just like 5.5 years.
Okay, so you're approaching that 5 to 6 year window stint. Like, are
Yeah.
you is the Asian travel still fueling that creative fire of like doing this motion work? Like, I know we've chatted offline, like you do some freelance stuff on the side, depending on what it is. And like your Instagram is like wildly curated around photos of Asia and things like that. Like, are you still creatively fueled from being there? Or like, are you thinking about like, maybe over the next year or two, like maybe it's time to come back home?
Um, I definitely don't think I'll be coming home to. Well, I mean, I need to come home from like we're finally done with COVID, so I can like physically come home for a visit. But I really enjoy being an expat, and I really enjoy living in Asia. So I don't think I'm necessarily done with that yet. But yeah, I'm trying to sort of. I'm definitely in like a sort of a point where I'm starting to think about what's next, and kind of where do I go from here. Uh, Especially, yeah, I think I'm still really interested in Asia, but I just think there's some really cool things. You mentioned kind of my freelance work, but I've been doing a couple projects with illustrators that are based in Bangkok, and I think there's like so much creative talent right now that's coming out of Southeast Asia, places like Bangkok, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur. So I'm
Sure.
pretty interested in what's happening there. So I'm just trying to sort of evaluate it still. And I think now that in China the borders have just reopened, so I think this next year is going to kind of allow for a lot more travel. And so I'm hoping to be able to kind of do some of that research and kind of, I guess, soul searching on like what comes next. But yeah.
What an exciting time then. I mean, that's amazing. Yeah, we were for all the listeners, we were just chatting right before we started recording around the borders being open, but like China took a different approach from the rest of the world, really, of COVID control and really locking things down and quarantine rules and things like that. So it's amazing to hear that you can now get out and you can explore again. What's something like in the next, let's call it, couple of years that like you've given a little bit of thought of, like a project or a type of work that you really want to kind of embrace or try to tackle?
Yeah, that's a good question. I get asked a lot because I do, like, on Instagram I post a lot of travel photos, and so I get a lot of questions of like, when are you going to do some sort of like photo journal or like a zine of kind of photos? And so I I am like continuously thinking about how do I sort of connect my interest in design with just either photography or just travel in general. So I'm trying to sort of think through something that's not just like a photo book, but something that Like for example, like I love there's this column in the New York Times called the Metropolitan Diary, where readers sort of send in these short stories, or like it can even be poetry, that's always centered around something about New York City. And what I love about it is, like, having lived there, it really sort of does give you a sense. You know, you might not necessarily be familiar with the place or the people that the story is talking about, but it feels inherently tied to this place. And it
Mm,
always comes with like a nice little like charcoal. They have a really good graphic designer there that does these illustrations. They're very simple, like kind of like charcoal illustrations. But something like that, I think, expanded for like these places I've been able to experience in Asia, I think would be really interesting. So allowing an audience to sort of feel that same proximity and that sort of detailed experience of life in a place like, I don't know, like middle of Indonesia, or rural China, um, or like urban Thailand. I think these are all things that I think people are interested in, and I think it's becoming. I think these places are becoming more popular for tourism, but also for commerce. You know, we like Singapore was a huge like kind of like capital for tech and finance, and they've sort of reached like a capacity with like the number of foreigners they can handle. And so I've seen a lot of talent now going to places like Malaysia or Indonesia, and so I think these are places that are going to be much more sort of, as the economy shifts and you have, especially post COVID, you have like distributed teams and remote work is much more kind of mainstream. And I think you're going to see a lot of interesting things and growth come out of this area. And so I'm definitely really interested in any sort of storytelling around these places, because just in my travel, there's just some really amazing places in Asia that I think
sure.
often get overlooked on like the usual tourist route. Um,
Right. No, that sounds like an awesome project. And like I love the storytelling or the ties even to like, you know, what's another creative has done with like the New York Times. I think that's such a
mhm.
cool, I didn't know about that segment. I've never lived in New York, but I think I got to look it up. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Um, super inspiring. A couple more questions for you, then we'll wrap it up.
Mhm.
This question I ask for, or I started to ask all the guests. You know, a lot of the people have been fortunate, are successful, or quote unquote successful, depending on what your definition is. What is, or who is somebody you would give like flowers to, who's helped you along your journey or your way, or who's inspired you, or you know, really helped you? I guess it could be, you know, Asia based, it could be homeland based, it could be, you know, work based, so like a coworker or anybody like who's really like helped you out like along your journey.
For sure. I, I'm going to say two people. I hope that doesn't break the
No, no,
rule.
no, that's fine.
I think so. The senior designer, when I was at IBM, and I had sort of made this move from like UX and like like UX and digital product design to this brand team, and the sort of senior designer on the team that I joined, this designer named Dave. He really sort of, I didn't join this team with any sort of like motion or animation background, and he basically spent like 6 to 8 months sitting with me, very sort of like intensively showing me, and giving me like a foundation in tools like After Effects. And I think that was probably some of the most valuable learning I've done in my career, or even in college, because it just sort of like, my career at post IBM has always been like motion graphics through the lens of branding, and I just wouldn't be able to do any of that work without that sort of base that he gave me. And it was, you know, it wasn't part of his formal responsibilities, but he really did give me like a half a year of just like, I'm going to show you how to do this, and I
Wow.
think it's been so valuable. Um,
Awesome.
so yeah, definitely he's been a very big important influence in my career. And then my last manager at OnePlus is this guy named Diego, and I just think he's a very strong brand and marketing thinker. And so we're just even now like 2 jobs post OnePlus. It's like we're constantly sort of like sending ideas to each other or like chatting and like seeing what we think about both things that we're working on, but also things that we sort of see being done elsewhere, and just trying to sort of think through, how we think, what we agree on, and kind of, where we can kind of push each other on ideation. So yeah, he's always like continually challenging me to think about brand and marketing in different ways.
I love that. No, those sounds like two great people that you have in your life or in your corner, on your path. That's awesome. Austin, this has been a tremendous episode of An Untold Narrative. 77 in, it's always amazing to hear from somebody with a completely different background from anybody else I've talked to, and an experience that is really one of a kind. So super appreciate you joining us. Last question, where could people find you? Website, we talked about your Instagram a couple times now. Where could people follow along your journey if they want to check it out?
Yeah. So yeah, my Instagram is Snoston. It's an SN before Austin, Snoston the Bear. I'm also really active on Vimeo. Okay. Yeah, I forget what my URL is. It's like Austin P or something, but that's
we'll make sure to link it in the bio.
Okay, cool. But yeah, so yeah, Instagram and Vimeo are where I'm quite active on.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been super cool.
Sweet. Thanks for having me, David. This is awesome.